Ah, yes, friends. And it is Adam Armbrecht on a Monday as we welcome you into OGP live on YouTube and, of course, coming to you in the podcast landscape wherever you're picking us up. Flying solo just to give you a update here to kick off the week. Obviously, we had week number 2 of OTAs wrap up. We touched on it at the end of last week, some things that we were taking away from it as rookies signed, they get into camp, expectations around different player personnel groups. And we'll certainly check in on some of those again here as the offseason continues to move along. But there are a few things that I think we're worth checking into here as we work our way through the offseason. A former player, former New York Football Giant, makes a little bit of news. And then we also want to take a look back at NFL news around the wide receiver position. Julio Jones, obviously, making a new home now in Tennessee. What does that mean to that wide receiver group ratings that we talked about on our previous episode and breaking down the Giants being number 11th overall? And how does that shift things? How dangerous does Tennessee become? And how do you evaluate veteran wide receiver talent versus the young upside, specifically around what Tennessee is doing here? You lose a player like Davis, you bring in Julio Jones. Where are they on the rising and falling? Obviously, the latter never being at the height of a Julio Jones, but you wonder what's the potential upside there. So as we dive into that, we'll also talk about the New York Football Giants' top wide receiver in Kenny Golladay and what might be in store for him inside of the New York Giants system. So we'll start with the fun one first. Sometimes you say comeback player of the year. I'm going to go with comeback player of the decade, were this to come to pass. Former New York Football Giant, great running back, amassed over 5,000 career rushing yards with Big Blue, obviously a contributor in winning Super Bowls for the New York Football Giants. And that's Brendon Jacobs. He made the news in commenting. So just in his time away from the game, he's been coaching youth football. He's been teaching and preaching how you can accomplish anything you want, put your mind to it, and you can achieve your goals. So that's the reason why his agent has been reaching out to some teams looking for an opportunity to get him into a training camp on a potential comeback. Now, the easy thing to be here, and this is more just the lighter side of New York Football Giants news, would be to say, what do we think a now almost 39-year-old running back is going to have left in the tank? There's very few players that come back at the running back position at this stage of their career. Very few players that make it this far in their career as a running back, maybe outside of a guy like Frank Gore, who seems to be immortal in that regard. But Brendon Jacobs is talking about coming back on the defensive side of the ball at the defensive end position. When he retired from the league, just to give you some context, he was 6'4", 264 as an NFL running back. So certainly the measurables would tell you that he'd be capable of being an impact player on that side. But that would also tell me that he's going to be in the form of a 23, 24, 25-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 35-year-old, not a nearly 40-year-old, and certainly someone who put a lot of wear and tear on his body playing at the running back position. He's confident. You know, the quotes that he put in and around this, there's a couple of layers to this. The NFL layer, he said, I've been feeling since I've been done that I still have something left in the tank. I think defensive end is something that I should have been playing to begin with, but I was real stubborn when it came down to moving to that position, Jacob said. I feel like I can do that. I feel like I can play not even just this season, but another 3 or 4 years at that position. Okay, so that's the first piece of it. And he goes on to say, no disrespect to guys playing in the NFL, but he thinks that he's a beast, thinks that he could take players on. Fine. But I think the real truth of this, the big takeaway, and this is a real positive, quoting Jacobs here again, I'm a high school football coach and I run a youth program. Believing in yourself and never saying I can't. That's part of the reason for this whole thing, to motivate the kids around me, Jacobs said. So the way that he sees and the way these kids speak about him is to say, Coach Jacobs went back and he played, and Coach Jacobs is doing good, and Coach Brendon taught us and coached us and continues to coach us. I want to go do what Coach Brendon did. I'm going to believe in myself like Coach Brendon did. That's my whole reason for any of this. So I think from that standpoint, it's an awesome story. This is just a former New York Football Giant who sees himself maybe in a position to be able to continue to inspire young kids to say, listen, there's never a point when you give up on the dream. Jacobs already achieved that dream, had success at the highest level, and then retired and is now helping youth football. That's fantastic. But I think that the lessons can still be instilled in these kids when you say, if it doesn't happen right away for you, or if maybe it never happens, all the drive and the focus and the training and the work ethic and that drive for that passion is all going to continue to carry over into different areas of your life. We always talk about how sports impacts beyond the field, learning about some of those tools that you can apply to anything that you're going to do beyond the sport. And it's a very rarefied air of players that end up going from high school to college and then ultimately to the NFL. So I think this is still a really nice learning lesson that you can pass on to these kids. Do I see Brendon Jacobs catching on? Maybe not, but he does, most likely not. But he does go on to say he's just looking. He doesn't know how it's going through his agent, but he's just looking to get into a camp. And if he can get into a camp and show, maybe he makes a first cut, maybe he doesn't, maybe he makes a second cut, maybe he doesn't. This is all in the vein of continuing to inspire these young kids. And if in some world he catches on with somebody and even makes it through the first round of cuts or something, even if he just shows a spark, we'll obviously be talking about it on here, and it'll be a fun little storyline to carry throughout the offseason. But beyond that, even if he never gets back onto an NFL field, we still love Brendon Jacobs. We still love what he was with Ahmad Bradshaw and what he brought to Big Blue over the course of the years. Moving beyond that, though, the other big real NFL news that came out, obviously, was that Julio Jones officially moves on from Atlanta, traded to the Tennessee Titans to join A.J. Brown there and to play with Ryan Tannehill and try to create a new tandem, a new dynamic duo. We know that Corey Davis moved on to the Jets in the offseason. And the question really here becomes to me, Corey Davis has never been what Julio Jones has been in his career. That much is an obvious statement. We don't need to go much beyond it. But at this stage of their respective careers, where's the bigger value? One player you're signing out of free agency, you're bringing him in to be a part of a receiving core, and you want to see him maybe start to really hit the prime, whatever the peak of his career is going to be. These next couple of seasons are where you think you're going to get the best out of him. For Julio Jones, this is a little bit of chicken or the egg, because I saw some things over on social media talking about that Matt Ryan doesn't get as much respect as he does at the quarterback position, that as Julio Jones has gotten a little bit older, 32, going to be 33 years old, that he started to slow down a little bit, started to have some of those wear and tear, some nagging injuries certainly, and that Matt Ryan has maybe elevated his game the way that Julio Jones elevated Matt Ryan early in his career. I think that at this point, as long as he can stay healthy, what you're going to get this upcoming season for the Tennessee Titans should be nothing short of spectacular. I think that Julio Jones right now, at this point of his career, if healthy, is still a far better receiver than Corey Davis is. He's far more dynamic, obviously, of a weapon. He's still an elite number one receiver, even if it's only for one more year before the bottom really falls out, as it happens with receivers, as it happened, by the way. Remember Roddy White for the Atlanta Falcons? There was this process where 1 year he was the man and then he was gone, right? And he never got back to that. Not like he moved on and then showed something somewhere else. I think Julio Jones still has more than enough left in the tank. And then more specifically, inside of this Tennessee Titans offense, who also lost Juno Smith in the offseason, along with Davis, but now you add in Julio Jones with Brown. These are two big boys, two guys going to be able to stretch the field, two guys that are going to get it at the highest point, going to get those contested balls, and all of this, the subplot is forcing those defenses to stay off the line of scrimmage and allowing yourself to work through that running game, right? I mean, Henry is still the engine that's going to move this offense, and it really was, I think, crucial for the Tennessee Titans to find a way to still manufacture that type of threat out of the receiving core, so you always leave these channels and lanes open. Now, with bringing in Julio Jones, you're going to have this dynamic 1-2 combination. You're going to start to put the pressure on defenses to say, where are you sending the help? How are you providing the extra body in the box to go up against that run game? And if not, all of a sudden those lanes open up. Henry gets to the second level with relative ease, or you worry about shutting down the run game, and now you're leaving yourself in single coverage, man-to-man on the outside. It's going to be a challenge. The curious thing for me is, if they choose? What will Tennessee, when they go out of the field, what will oppositions look to say? Let's go ahead and give it everything we got to stop Henry and see if Tannehill can find his receivers, can get these options with consistency, always try to give some of that safety help, maybe over the top, pick your poison mentality, sure. But I still think it is shut down the running game and live with the results in a lot of ways. Because as we know, as New York Football Giants fans, you got Bradbury, and he certainly helped elevate that secondary. But you're going to have to deal with options 1, 2, 3, tight end position. There's always going to be these multiple facets to an offense that you have to look at defending, and you are living with the results, right? Shutting a wide receiver down, a number one. If you shut him down 30% of the time in a game, that's a big success rate. You're just trying to avoid the home run plays. So I wonder if a lot of defenses will look to bubble their secondary, not get beat over the top with big explosive plays in the receiving game, and then make sure you're always pouring in your highest level of focus into the running game. But either way you slice it, it makes it incredibly dynamic. And one of the things that I wanted to look back at when we talked about that wide receiving core, now all of a sudden, remember, coming into this year, this is what we were talking about. This is now, in this particular one, this is going off of Pro Football Focus. So as we come back into it, we're going to be talking about Dallas Cowboys are listed up there at number 1 in this one. Tampa Bay, number 2. Atlanta was number 3. Obviously, in some regards, they're going to have to take a step back when you're losing Julio Jones. Then we talk about the New Orleans Saints and the dynamic combinations that are Michael Thomas. You think about who's going to be behind them. They had Emmanuel Sanders, but you wonder what's going to happen there. Buffalo Bills have been dynamic, the Kansas City Chiefs, Detroit Lions, Arizona Cardinals. As we continue to work our way down this list, we want to get to where are the Tennessee Titans. The Tennessee Titans, as I keep scrolling, they're going to come up as the 16th team here, okay? So they were in a season coming into last year. This is where they were coming into last season with A.J. Brown and then Corey Davis. You have to think, like for like, one out, one in. That's got to elevate you, maybe over the top of, by the way, this was the Houston Texans of old that didn't have the proper, hadn't lost DeAndre Hopkins yet. He hadn't gone to Arizona, all those things. But you're going to get you into the mix here, I think. And we'll try to see if we can come with another comp that really elevates the range that we're talking about here as far as where these teams are entering this 2021 season. And we have up here real quick when we talk about just elite talent, wide receiver individuals, not the receiving cores overall. Where do we end up having Julio Jones? Listed as 5th on the Atlanta Falcons. Listed at 6th was A.J. Brown and the Tennessee Titans. So if you're talking about coming into this year with 2 of the top 10 potential wide receivers, and you can argue where they go in the shuffle and who could come up into that hierarchy, that's fine. But as you start to go down the list here and we think about who else is around, a guy like Justin Jefferson out there in Minnesota, maybe he's going to take that next big leap. Calvin Ridley in Atlanta, does he suffer a little bit losing Julio Jones? You'd assume that he would. And all I want to get down to is here, Amari Cooper at 14, Metcalf at 15, Allen for the Chargers at 16. But when do we finally get down to Kenny Golladay, 19th overall for the New York Football Giants? Got to like that. Corey Davis at 20. So there you go, right? We're talking about A.J. Brown being a top 10 receiver in the league, now adding, you would think, a top 10 talent still at this point of his career in lieu of a top 20 kind of player in Corey Davis. So that change, that shift is going to make Tennessee a more dynamic team, no doubt about that, and it's going to be interesting to see how it pays off. We won't know. Regular season is going to be one thing. We won't know until playoff time and getting over some of those humps and then looking at big matchups, especially in the AFC, like with the Kansas City Chiefs. You need to have the firepower, to go toe-to-toe with them down after down, series after series, and try to get yourself into a deeper playoff run because with Ryan Tannehill, you feel like that window is a little bit smaller than some of these other teams. Obviously, on Mahomes, you talk about some of the other young guys out there like Herbert for the Chargers. You've got young quarterbacks that are on the rise. Allen for the Bills, right? Tannehill a few years older. So that window, I think it's worth over-investing, taking the shot right now, thinking I have a real chance here, maybe to be a surprise and a team that could get all the way to a Super Bowl next season, get into an AFC championship matchup and see what happens. That's what I think Tennessee is willing to invest here. Last but not least, as we move our way through some of the news and notes around the league, Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay obviously got into camp this past week, and what we're really curious to see here, and I want to get a couple of quotes as we talk about what the New York Football Giants could look to do. And this is Joe Judge and how he envisions using Kenny Golladay and talking about a mix of what he did in Detroit. When you add new players to the roster, this is Joe Judge speaking, through free agency or the draft, you're going to try to build in different things that fit to their strengths. Obviously, there's going to be an element of what he did so well in Detroit that we'll try to incorporate and let him play to his strengths. And then we'll try to find things that fit us that he hasn't done in the past and make sure that we fit them in as we go. He went on to add, everyone saw on tape, this guy has been a physical player for years. He's made a lot of tough catches, a lot of big plays with the ball in his hands running. He brings a physical toughness. That's something we saw on tape, and we want to build on that and that strength whenever or whatever we can do within our offense. So the things you take away there is contested catches, yes. But I think when you talk about adding in a guy like Kadarius Toney, and then you already have a player like Darius Slayton, and then we know the veteran Sterling Shepard. The goal here to me for the New York Football Giants is going to be to say, every time that we line up, you're not going to know, is Shepard, Toney, Slayton, Golladay, Ingram, are they running the deep routes, or are they going to be running underneath? Is Kadarius Toney taking an end-around sweep, or are they running a bubble screen to Kenny Golladay? I think what the Giants and what Joe Judge are looking at on the offensive side of the ball is that Kenny Golladay, for all of his size, can also be a player that ball in his hands can be a creative after-the-catch dynamic weapon as well. So if you think about it in that regard, Evan Ingram, theoretically on paper, should be able to get the ball in his hands and be dynamic after the catch. Sterling Shepard is shown, especially out of the slot, get it into his hands quickly, let him work after the catch. And even a player like Darius Slayton, who I think, again, skill set expectation-wise, you're going to bring him back down to earth. But there is that world where Slayton can be dynamic after the catch. So on a given down and distance, if you're running a 4 wide receiver set especially, you could be talking about having all 4 of your top receivers, Golladay, Shepard, Toney, and Slayton, and not knowing which dynamic route combinations you're going to run with them. Likewise, when you get Evan Ingram into that mix, or even when it's Kyle Rudolph, especially down in the red zone, talk about being able to spread guys out and offer the ability and opportunity for Daniel Jones to say, if we get enough space and distance here, well, underneath routes for a Shepard, for a Toney are going to be very nice and easy to work with. If I end up getting single coverage, though, I can look to the outsides. And even though Slayton's not the biggest player in the world, he certainly has shown a physical presence and the ability to go attack that ball. So now he's a red zone option. Obviously, Kenny Golladay is. And then you add into the mix that you can bring in a guy like Kyle Rudolph and use his incredible percentage catch rate to try to accomplish the goal that the Giants have struggled to do, and that's converting red zone opportunities into red zone touchdowns, and specifically off the arm of Daniel Jones. And that's the thing that I don't think we're going to know until we see it. Offensive line is a curiosity, right? And a footnote, by the way, inside of all this is over the course of the second week of OTAs, Will Hernandez lined up starting right guard. They were running the sets where it was Thomas, Lemieux, Gates, Hernandez, and Pert. This is the lineup that I talked about all summer long, that this would be the most ideal version for the New York Football Giants. I think if Fulton ended up starting at right guard, it would be what it is. But in a world where Hernandez just needed to take a step back to retool himself a little bit, and then in that absence, Lemieux emerged and showed that he's capable of being a starting caliber left for you. If Hernandez can re-find a new identity for himself at right guard, that's the dream scenario. He would become, along with Gates, the two oldest at around 25, 26 years old on the offensive line with those other 3 young players complementing them. That's the ideal scenario. So now, though, when you expand it out to the wide receiving core and we talk about how dynamic can all these things be, can you develop all these options and route tree combinations for Golladay and all these other players? Certainly, as long as that offensive line does the work up front. The other footnote, as we wrap this one up and get ourselves out the door, and a shout out over to Ricardo joining us in on the live stream. Many thanks, Ricardo. We've been away for a couple of days on YouTube, but happy that when we come back, so do you. To tie this back in, though, when you talk about Tennessee and adding in a veteran like Julio Jones, and then we think about just the overall wide receiving core, the Giants were there at 11th when we reviewed this last week. Certainly Tennessee is jumping up those charts from wherever they had previously been ranked. But it's the unknown right now. For Tennessee, it's the known commodities. You have Brown. Now you add Jones. You have Henry in the backfield. All known things that you can say, check, check, check. This is what we're going to get. On the flip side of it, for the Giants, it's, well, slight question mark coming off of injury maybe for Kenny Golladay. But even if you move beyond the injury piece of it, okay, rookie, Kadarius Toney. He arguably could become the second most important wide receiver on this offense by the time it's all said and done. He could be Minnesota Vikings, Justin Jefferson type of player for us. So if in week 1, 2, and 3, you start to see things clicking for Kadarius, well, then all of a sudden this wide receiving core just elevates automatically, and everybody's going to benefit off of his quality of play. If it takes him some time to come along, which is fine, it's not going to be something that's going to make or break how we judge him. But if it takes him the first half of the season, 3/4 of the year to really find his rhythm, find out how they want to use him, if the offensive line is still working out some kinks, well, now all of a sudden everything else trickles down from there, because now there's pressure on Sterling Shepard to be consistently in slot and being the threat there. Now you're a little bit less diverse because you can't move him to the outside. You can't necessarily pull Kenny Golladay into the slot position to get a more favorable matchup. So that I think is the difference when we talk about where we rank these wide receiving cores, and going back to the conversation Andy and I had last week. It's hard for me to overinvest in where they rank them, because go back to last year when coming into the season, they said, well, if Golden Tate and Sterling Shepard and Evan Ingram, you talked about all these guys and Slayton. Okay. There was a little bit of overhype on that machine, right? And as the season moved along, and we know everything that went on with Golden Tate, et cetera. But as that season moved along, I think you took the step back and you said, yes, offensive line play. But even beyond that, for me at least, we saw the redundancy in terms of positions and the skill sets of these different players on the roster, and the development of a fifth round draft pick like Darius Slayton. And all this, it was a big wake up moment where you go, we weren't that dynamic. Now, if you had a healthy Saquon Barkley, that could have looked different. But we were banking on reliability and consistency from a tight end that hadn't shown that to this point of his career, and may still not. Fingers crossed, no drops, training camp, come on. But now you do feel like you have a more quantifiable weapon in Kenny Golladay. This is unique since Odell Beckham Jr. have not had this caliber of player that has the ceiling that he has. If that box gets checked and Sterling Shepard is healthy, those are the first two things. If those for this season, if those two boxes get checked, then Kadarius Toney gets to flourish in any number of ways. If Shepard struggles from a health standpoint, and Toney has to elevate, or Slayton has to be relied on more, or the defenses get to start to from that box and really hone in on Saquon Barkley, things are a little fragmented. It starts to be harder to run this offense. And I'll leave you with the idea here as we wrap up this episode here on a Monday. One of the things, we'll go at the end of the day, as we like to say, one of the things that it's going to be interesting to see is the opinion that the fan base develops about Kenny Golladay based on the offensive line play and the play of Daniel Jones. So many of these things, and we've talked about, are the Giants being disrespected? I think it's legitimate. I think from the inside, we look and say, look at the talent, give us health, watch out. But as we've mentioned before too, is Daniel Jones about to take a Josh Allen type leap forward, or is it going to be marginal improvement? Is Saquon Barkley going to come back and be the exact same player that he once was? We think so. We don't know for sure. Is Kenny Golladay 100% of the player that he was prior to injury last year? Hips are a tricky injury, especially for a bigger receiver. We think, we hope, we want, right? There's a lot of questions. There's enough questions to say until week 1, until week 2, until week 3, until you see the consistency from so many different individual players and also units, offensive line. I can't overinvest in what this season can look like. It doesn't mean that it's any less exciting. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to be waiting with bated breath for this season to kick off. But at the end of the day, I do need to see all of these things click. And in a lot of regards, it does right there under center with Daniel Jones. We mentioned the deep throw accuracy, the potential for that to be a dynamic element. And the end of the at the end of the day statement I wanted to make was we beat up maybe Jason Garrett a little bit last year, right? We talked about was the offense dynamic enough. And I think it's easy off of his time in Dallas to say, look at all the offensive weapons they had. Look how they weren't able to achieve. They were always very talented teams. Last year, unlike years in Dallas, I think Jason Garrett does deserve some level of wiggle room, some level of adjustment, right? Year number one with Daniel Jones, with a young rebuilding offensive line. Now year number two, dynamic weapons added in. I think now we'll see what this offense could have looked like last year if you had total health, even with a slightly less talented wide receiving core. Now you have all the weapons. You have the versatility of those weapons. It's just about going out and executing. So it'll be interesting to see. I'll be very curious if we reevaluate where these wide receiver groups are, maybe 4 games, a quarter of the way through the year. And that's how you'll know the trajectory of this New York Football Giants team. Even if we say they're number 11 right now, by week 4, they got to be top 10. That's this team making the playoffs. That's this team winning this division. If they're right around 11 or 12 still, okay. Let's see at midpoint of the season then. We're going to keep checking in on where these wide receivers are and where the development is, not only of the rookie Tony, but even a player like Darius Slayton, even a veteran, as Andy would tell you, Pro Bowler Evan Ingram. Is he consistent now in the season? Is the pressure off of him with all these other around him, or do we still see the same errors and the same mistakes, the same mental lapses? Because he's still an important piece for as long as he's a part of. We'll be back in on Wednesday. We'll break down any news and notes around the New York Football Giants. We'll start to look at some other position groups that we talked about, what the expectations are going to be, how it will become more dynamic, and of course, updates on Brendon Jacobs' big return to the NFL, 39-year-old defensive end. We shall see. Until next time, friends, as Andy Makowitz would want, would need, and frankly, would demand that you know, let's, as always, go Big Blue.